What's interesting about climbing is it's a means of coming to grips with what you're afraid of. You're afraid of falling. To reach the point where that doesn't control you, that's a good place to get. It's not like, oh, well, I'm not afraid. No, you climb because you're afraid.
Everything that goes on happens with this intense exposure. The fact that there's so much air underneath you, there's so much rock still above you, and that it continues on either side forever and ever.
Nobody in any sport, no Super Bowl, no World Series, can even remotely touch this. That's why it's the king of the sports, you know.
We were, full of hormones and young guys just trying to prove what they can do.
The vertical proving grounds were, and are, the majestic granite monoliths, the walls of Yosemite. There is nothing like them in the world. That is why the world wends its way to Central California to see them. And that is why some people try to climb them. Those efforts, a century and a half of those efforts, have made Yosemite the center of world rock climbing. From afar, Yosemite's walls look unapproachable, unascendable, unclimbable. They had been. They are no longer. This is the story of what changed. Before Yosemite became home to rock climbers, it was home to Native Americans of the Yosemite Miwok tribe. To them, El Capitan was Tutakanula, named in honor of a legendary inchworm. Larger animals, according to the legend, left dark traces on the rock as they tried to get to the top and rescue two stranded bear cubs. Only the inchworm was successful. Climbers on Tutakanula have been likened to inchworms too. When white settlers migrated to the west, Yosemite's legend changed. The California Geologic Survey hired mountaineers in the 1860s to find whatever mineral deposits might be inside all that unmapped and untapped beauty. They included William Brewer, Charles Hoffman, Clarence King, and Josiah Whitney. And they were stunned.
They would go up one peak, and they'd see another peak from the top of this peak, and they'd rush home and rest and get more supplies, and then head off the next day into this new peak they discovered.
Already, Yosemite was asserting itself as a force to be admired, beyond any mineral deposits.
If you look at the great mountaineers of California, you see this wonderful fusion of encountering the mountains as scientific fact, but also encountering the mountains as moral and imaginative adventure. But if you're deliberately going out and existentially encountering the mountain, probe its scientific nature, and then very powerfully to probe your own nature through the encounter with the mountain, well, that's a very sophisticated, highly self-conscious, complex and creative act.
The first act in the evolution of Yosemite climbing had begun. While early mountaineers climbed most of the Sierra Nevada peaks, The vertical walls of Yosemite remained untouched. Josiah Whitney declared, "The summit of Half Dome never will be trodden by human foot." Local resident John Conway disagreed. He led a group of energetic young boys on the first serious attempt to reach the summit, up its slippery northeast shoulder in 1871.
As these young boys were scampering up the slopes, the idea was that they would kind of haul a little rope up with them and climb up as high as they can and then nail some spikes into the cracks there and attach the rope to the cracks. They really didn't get very far.
In 1875, a Scottish trail builder by the name of George Anderson came along and drilled holes into Half Dome 5 to 6 feet apart, then hammered spikes into those holes. The technique worked. After days of drilling, he stood on the spikes and, attaching a rope to them, used it as a cable to climb all the way to the top. The first major ascent in Yosemite, indeed, the first major ascent in North America, was made. But of even more importance than the what was the how. This was the first such ascent done with extensive use of artificial holds that permanently changed the rock. Meanwhile, another Scotsman had fallen in love with Yosemite. At his first glance, he proclaimed, "Every rock in its walls seemed to glow with life, as if into this one mountain mansion, nature had gathered her choicest treasures." He also became one of Yosemite's first climbers, and to many, the father of Yosemite. He was John Muir. Some men climb to conquer nature. John Muir was not one of them.
Muir, the mountaineer, listened patiently, sort of looked, heard, was instructed, put himself in harmony with nature, and then made the move.
He was the first kind of climbing bum in the Sierra Nevada because he completely kind of left civilization and all the trappings of civilization behind and just went off into the mountains. All he needed to exist was just a little bit of tea, some breadcrumbs stuffed in his pockets, and he would just spend the night in his old army coat, curled up under a boulder someplace.
John Muir climbed the almost 11,000-foot high Cathedral Peak without any equipment at all, not even a rope. He left behind no spikes or holes. His ethic was leave it natural, leave it as it was. He did leave behind a legacy or two. He founded a wilderness outing and preservation group, which he named the Sierra Club. And because of John Muir's efforts, Yosemite became a national park. For decades, the rock stayed not only natural, but more or less out of sight and mind to anyone but the few who clambered up or around its countless slopes. Then, in 1931, the old stone spires and granite faces got new attention. Francis Farquhar, a mountaineer who later wrote the definitive history of the Sierra Nevada, invited the internationally renowned climber Robert Underhill to California to teach the basics of rope climbing to Farquhar and his climbing friends. The basics meant using pitons, narrow steel spikes with a hole at the back end that are hammered into the cracks in the rock. The basics meant using carabiners, the metal snap links capable of holding more than a ton, which attach a rope to the pitons. The basics especially meant learning a new safety system of belaying, by which a rope secured to an anchor position connects climbers so that no one can fall too far. The eager and enthusiastic students included Marjorie Bridge Farquhar. She would become the first woman to take part in a roped first ascent in Yosemite.
Francis came back from having climbed with Bob Underhill with the Harvard Mountaineering Club. He was all keyed up to show a group of us how to use the rope. And then Dick Leonard came along, and some of these fellows, they really got hepped up about it. So that we got to the point where we went into pitons and carabiners and began doing it correctly.
We started with a cotton clothesline, which later turned out had a strength of about 200 pounds. And the climber below would rise up and put his weight on it with the rope around the hips of the belayer up above, who, by the way, always was anchored back to the trees or the rocks behind him so that he wouldn't be pulled off.
In 1932, Dick Leonard, Francis Farquhar, and Jules Eichhorn formed the Cragmont Climbing Club, named after a practice rock they climbed in Berkeley. Before long, it merged with the rock climbing section of the Sierra Club.
We actually practiced falling, catching a fall. A fellow would jump 10, 15 feet free fall, and we would catch them before they reached the ground. Once in a while, we'd reach the ground first, but most of the time we had 6 or 8 inches left over.
I rappelled one time off a 200-foot overhang, and I deliberately dropped at half the acceleration of gravity, 16 feet per second, accelerating every second. And I ended up at the bottom of the 200 feet. There was a big column of smoke, about 5 feet long, going up behind my rear end.
Climber Mike Corbett collects climbing artifacts, including old ropes.
When the climbing got difficult, you always sent the smallest and lightest person up first, because if they did fall, since they weighed the least, they had the best chance of not breaking the rope. That's not very comforting for the small guys, for small climbers.
Safety was a major concern because the equipment was so weak. Among the Berkeley climbers, it was Dick Leonard who made it his business to teach the leader, the person leading the climb up the mountain, not to fall. One person who learned the lesson well was later nominated 3 times for the Nobel Peace Prize for his international environmental work.
Dick Leonard thought it'd be nice to save leaders and figure out belaying techniques and use the consecutive climbing systems and so on. It made it a lot safer. Or I certainly wouldn't be here if not.
In the summer of 1933, Leonard, Eichhorn, and Bester Robinson decided the practice rocks of Berkeley no longer offered enough of a challenge. They headed to Yosemite, specifically to higher Cathedral Spire.
A spire is attractive because it is so sharp, and there's no way up except by climbing up the easiest side of it. We investigated these spires very carefully through Ansel Adams' photographs and the photographs of Francois Matthes, the great geologist of Yosemite. We started on an overhang on the higher spire, driving some 8-inch nails into the crack. Fortunately, we were intelligent enough to know that if the rope started running through that loop of 3/8-inch rope, it would burn it through. Couldn't do it. So then we gave it up.
They tried again in November and again gave up, halfway up. Their third try was the following April. Their ascent became a landmark in North American mountaineering.
Well, we had only iron pitons, which we purchased from Sporthaus Schuster in Munich, and they were a variety, blades and angles.
What they started to do was hammer in the piton sideways, which was really never done before. Very, very innovative way of putting a piton. But what they did was they adapted the equipment for the climb.
We were up about 500 feet up on a big ledge, and we were yodeling down below. And one of the tourists came dashing in to Chief Branger of the park at the time and said, "There's a couple of guys up on the cliffs who are stuck up there and are hollering for help." He said, "Those guys are Bester Robinson and Dick Leonard. And if they can't get down, nobody can get them down.
The ranger was right. They didn't need rescue. They reached the pinnacle of Higher Cathedral Spire, the tallest yet climbed in Yosemite. The group's greatest satisfaction came in showing the proper use of climbing techniques could get a team up difficult ascents safely.
That was really a milestone in Yosemite climbing because they were very much pushing the limits, not just for that time, but for the difficulty of the climb, the sustained nature of the climb, and the fact that of course, rescue was virtually impossible at that time. The stakes went higher and higher and higher.
In 1936, Morgan Harris raised the stakes when he made the first ascent of the Royal Arches using what was later known as the Pendulum Traverse.
It's not particularly hard, but it does involve going up high and putting a piece of gear in, being lowered off of it and running back and forth on the wall to swing across to get past a blank area and reach a crack or a ledge, things like that. And we commonly do that, especially in Yosemite, because in Yosemite it's vertical cracks that are your natural avenues to the top.
During World War II, the attention of most climbers was diverted from such peaceful victories. The valley's famous Ahwahnee Hotel was used as a hospital and recuperating facility for the U.S. Navy, and many of the climbers enlisted in the Army. They helped form its 10th Mountain Division. Among them, there too was David Brower as an instructor.
We had learned of how important mountain fighting had been in World War I from the stories of it, particularly what happened in the Alps. And that helped us decide that if we got into a situation like that, we wanted to be competent to handle it. We wanted to know how to handle rough terrain, cliffs if necessary, and not be freaked out because it's rough. I might be to claim I had a hand in teaching 10,000 people how to climb mountains and didn't lose anybody.
Climber Dick Leonard was assigned to the Quartermaster Corps in Washington, D.C., where he made a valuable contribution of another kind. He developed nylon ropes for his friends in the Mountain Corps. They were durable, elastic, and strong, and if handled correctly, would not break. For a climber, a sturdy rope could mean the difference between life and death on a fall. Once the war ended, weary veterans took nylon ropes to a peaceful training ground. Yosemite's walls beckoned as never before.
The Second World War kind of interrupted a lot of our lives, and when I came back to California along with a number of other young men who had been in Europe or in the Pacific, we had to do something to get the orneliness out of us, and so we started climbing back in the valley of Yosemite.
Climbers of the first post-war years included a man who became another legend. He was decades older than most of the other climbers. He was Swiss, he was bold and inventive. His name was John Salathe, and he impressed a climber who would become a legend himself, Yvon Chouinard. Chouinard was impressed not only by how Salathe climbed, but how he forged. He reinvented pitons. Yosemite's granite cracks are so hard on pitons, many of the old soft iron pitons buckled and twisted when they were hammered in and had to be left behind. Not Salathe's.
The original Salathe pitons were made out of Model A Ford axles, which is a chrome vanadium steel, very hard steel. You know, he was a blacksmith, so, you know, he could make a piton out of anything.
The pitons also impressed climber and author of the book Camp 4, Steve Roper.
Salathe's pitons, you could drive those guys into incipient cracks, just pound them as hard as you could, and they would go in, and they would stay, and you could take them out, and they wouldn't have a mark on them. For a big climb, you only had to take maybe 15 or 20 pitons. And if you were using soft pitons, you'd have to take hundreds. And that would be a gigantic load. You couldn't do it.
We were coming from the tradition of John Muir, which said, you don't leave anything behind. You leave no trace behind. And so we wanted to use these hard steel pitons to not only open up new routes that you couldn't do otherwise, but to put the pitons in and take them out.
Salathe gathered his pitons and his confidence to make the most difficult climb ever attempted in all of North America, Yosemite's Lost Arrow Spire.
The talk among some of the pre-war climbers that would be one of the great ascents if it could ever be made. And of course, I felt rather like John did, that we were aiming for the best and that we should get to it before somebody else did.
At first, Salathe attempted to climb the spire alone and failed. He tried again with a partner and almost made it. Then, Axe Nelson put his own idea in play. On Labor Day weekend in 1946, Nelson, his friend Jack Arnold, who was a prisoner of war in Germany, had dreamed of climbing the spire, and two other climbing partners hiked to the rim near Yosemite Falls. Their plan was to toss a rope over the spire and pull themselves to the summit that way. After hundreds of attempts, the rope went over.
That night, Arnold and I went down to sleep in the notch and climbed around the next day to where we could get to this line and pull the heavy nylon ropes over the top of the arrow, guiding it very carefully by somebody on the rim, moving back and forth so that it wouldn't fall off.
It did not fall off, and neither did they. Many climbers were impressed by the daring, but scorned the climbing techniques. As for Salathe, he was infuriated to be robbed of his expected triumph by what he called a rope trick.
Thought it was extremely unfair and dirty tricks and all the rest of it, that it should be done that way. And he said that if he could get a proper climbing partner, that he'd go back the next year and do it right.
Hard feelings or not, Salathe teamed up with Nelson to take on the Lost Arrow Spire together. After 5 days of climbing and 4 nights of bivouacking, sleeping on the wall, the pair conquered this milestone without a rope trick. The sense of challenge grew. Now, the imposing north face of Sentinel Rock beckoned a young climber who found great satisfaction in being a pioneer, Alan Steck.
You see it, and you naturally think, well, there's a possibility of a route there, and sure enough, there was.
Over the 4th of July weekend in 1950, when Steck realized most of the other climbers were off leading trips in the High Sierra, he convinced John Salathe to join him up Sentinel. Salathe by then was over 50, more than twice as old as then 24-year-old Steck. They faced their main difficulty on Sentinel at the highest point reached on previous climbs. Above them stretched so-called chimneys, cracks so wide they must be climbed from inside. Usually, a climber leans against one side of the inside of the chimney and supports himself by bending one leg to the wall beneath his back, the other leg stretched to the other side. Then, the climb begins. Making the pair's attempt more difficult, they were running out of water.
The heat was extraordinary. It was about 100 degrees. When you get in the upper chimneys, the air is cool in there. But John did this marvelously. Still, being low on water intensifies your agony. So there wasn't much we could do. We had to get off, so we just toughed it out. We had a half a cup of water at the end there. And John took his little quarter cup and he fished around in his rucksack and pulled out his false teeth, and he took all the water to lubricate his teeth so he can get them back in. So none of that water ever got down to where it was really needed.
The two reached where they really wanted to go, however. They completed the climb of Sentinel in a continuous, self-contained style that would set the standard for Yosemite climbing. It was Salathe's last big climb in the valley, but by no means the end of his influence.
He had this sense of style of never taking the easy way out, which meant avoiding drilling a hole in the rock and putting in an expansion bolt, which anybody can do. He did that when it was absolutely necessary, but he was the one of all the climbers that we knew or heard of who could push that the furthest. So he became our kind of standard to aim at.
Royal Robbins, who would later apply Salathe's climbing style to Yosemite's biggest walls, was hooked.
pure rock climbing, if you want to get the maximum adventure, you get on a big wall. And so it was the adventure that was particularly attractive. Just the idea of being a climber, of being someone up there on a rock face in a dangerous position and in control, that appealed to me. So I just poured myself into climbing and started climbing wherever I could.
In 1957, Robbins linked up with two partners to try a climb much higher and harder than Sentinel. It was the first ascent of the northwest face of Half Dome.
Sentinel Rock leans back, Half Dome's dead vertical. So it was a big step. It was very scary, and we took a while doing it, even approaching it, because it was so awe-inspiring. We didn't know we were ready. We failed in 1955, I think it was, and it took us 2 years to return. We felt a little bit more able to do it by the time we came back, because we'd been thinking about it for 2 years. We've been climbing it in our mind for 2 years. So that's the way you do it. You first have to climb it inside of yourself, and you can climb it outside.
Someone else had his eyes on Half Dome and had been part of Robbins' earlier attempt to climb it. That someone was a free-spirited, wine-drinking, woman-loving climber who shared the name of a president. But Warren Harding was attracted to higher climbs, not higher office.
1953, I started going out with the Sierra Club and learning hands-on rock climbing. Just get the general hang of belaying and rappelling and all that stuff. I guess our plan was to go to the valley and make big first ascents. Kind of a false hero type thing.
While Harding was preparing to put up his own first ascent of Half Dome, he learned that Robbins and his partners were already partway up. So Harding hiked up the back trail and congratulated the climbers at the summit. He was so disappointed, however, he felt there was only one course left: to be the first person to climb the major remaining prize, El Capitan.
Harding had a devil-may-care attitude toward the cliffs. He sort of said, let's go up and have fun. We take our wine, we'll fix ropes, bring women up to the ledges occasionally, and they did that occasionally. If things weren't going well on a certain day, you'd come down and leave your fixed ropes, go up another time. Royal would look up at a climb and figure out how to do it and say, I think I can do this with very few bolts. I can do it fairly quickly, and it'll be a grand adventure. It was always a farce with Harding. And with Royal, it was very serious business.
This falls into that category of two camps, if you will, but Warren and I kind of exemplified the camps. I took a kind of traditional approach that it's not getting to the top that counts, it's the way you do it. And Harding came from the school of, hey, what I want to do is get up this damn wall, and I'm going to do it any way I please, and if you don't like it, too bad.
El Capitan is serious business no matter how it's approached. Climbers have called this 3,000-foot granite monolith the crown jewel of American rock climbing, the reason for the pilgrimage to Yosemite.
El Capitan is the most beautiful wall in the world, I think. It's the most perfect granite, and it was right there in the valley, and it was basically saying, look, climb me if you can.
Warren Harding heard the captain's call, roped a few other climbers into the effort, and started up. They chose the most prominent route on the rock face, the so-called nose.
We figured we'd get as high as we could and string the thing with fixed ropes and come down and then go back up. The term is siege climbing. Maybe we invented that or caused it to be invented.
Much of the equipment that the climbers used on El Capitan in 1958 was homemade. They would take scraps of I-beam steel, drill a hole in it for a carabiner to attach to the rope, and shape it to the cracks. This thing weighs about 4 pounds. You can see the hammer that they used, one of the hammers they used on El Capitan, was just from a hardware store.
We invented this wonderful dolt cart to haul supplies up the side. People today can't believe that anybody was idiotic enough to come up with such a contraption.
They cut the legs off of old junkyard stoves. They took those junkyard stove legs, reshaped them into pitons, and that's the type of equipment they were using. I look at that equipment and it looks like it was designed by a caveman.
After Harding and his group got about halfway up the route, after many trips to bolt ropes into place, they aborted their effort, for the time being. Part of the reason was that the passion of the climbers rubbed off on the tourists. They stopped to watch Harding's friends watch him, and eventually created traffic jams. Park Service rangers told Harding to hold off until after the tourist season. He did, but that meant climbing in shorter days in colder weather.
In November of '58, Wayne Mary and George Whitmore and I set out with the idea that we were either going to make it in this push or abandon the thing.
We would come down off the fixed line and be festooned with slings and beaners and all kinds of stuff. And I remember Warren Harding saying, as he was pulling the stuff off and dropping it on the ground, "I'm getting sick of going up and down these goddamn ropes. Let's come back and go up there and stay with it until we finish it, or it finishes us."
The men who climbed with Harding may have been concentrating more on survival than on style. Each pitch, every section of the climb, took them higher into unknown territory.
When you get up there, you feel like you're on a vertical granite ocean. It just seems to stretch infinitely far in all directions. And it spooks a lot of people. I remember one morning, opened my eyes and looked around and thought, what the hell am I doing here? Jesus, I want to be anywhere else in the world.
Farther up the granite, Warren Harding was getting spooked too.
Near the bottom of the great roof, there's a little stance, about a foot by half a foot, that you come out on. Somehow I must have been nervous, because you get a clear sweep down the side of El Cap about 2,000 feet, just straight down to the ground. And I'm always criticized for overbolting. I did overbolt there. I had one solid bolt, and I clipped into it and went right ahead and drilled another one. So I consider that the only bolt I've ever placed that I didn't really need.
Well, the last days were tough because we had a little fall storm which came in. Fortunately, it was so steep that most of the snow went past us and didn't hit us. The main problem was that we didn't have much food and water left. So when we took off, it was on short rations, and we pretty well had to get to the top fast.
By about 9 o'clock that evening, I was running out of everything, and by golly, I could see a headlamp. So I yell at George, "Did you bring bolts?" He says, "Of course."
And that's when the all-night marathon started, where Warren was leaning over backwards, drilling bolt after bolt after bolt. I forget how many there were, but he spent the entire night setting the bolts over the final overhang there.
And he was up there, looked like a little black spider, pounding his hammer upward, repeatedly, and he kept it up all night, which was pretty remarkable. And I remember just before 6 the last morning, he called down. He says, "Can you hang on for one more bolt?" Could we hang on?
Well, I'm up here. What do you think? I might as well keep going, I guess.
They did keep going. By the next morning, Harding and his crew had climbed El Capitan for the first time.
After we'd finished the climb, we didn't have any pictures of the last pitch because it was done in the dark. So Harding and I walked back in along the trail to the top with the intention of rappelling down to the last ledge and getting pictures of the last pitch, just to complete the story. We tossed a rappel rope down, and I backed off over this rounded edge and looked down, and when I could suddenly see the full face underneath me, I was just boggled, you know. My gut just clenched right up, and holy mackerel, what am I doing here? And I said, Warren, I don't know if I feel up to this. And he said, oh, come on, I'll do it. I'll go down first. So he started. He did the same thing. He looked down and he said, let's do this another time. And we went home.
The first ascent of El Capitan had taken over 45 days, spread over a year and a half, literally on and off the wall.
Climbing El Capitan for the first time was totally new. After somebody's done it, you might do a harder route on the same wall, but there's a different element of the unknown involved.
For Royal Robbins and the others, the unknown did not end with the first ascents. In 1960, he got 3 other climbers to agree to try to climb El Capitan without coming down until they reached the top. It was the same style inaugurated by John Muir a decade earlier.
Royal said, we're going to do a self-contained, continuous ascent, and would you like to join us? And I was a relatively new climber, and like I like to say it, I didn't know enough to say no, and so that changed my life. Going with Royal and Chuck Pratt and Joe Fritchen on the second ascent of the Nose, which ended up taking 7 days, was an experience that I've never been the same since.
About a year after that triumph, Royal Robbins, Chuck Pratt, and Tom Frost refined the art of big wall climbing when they tried another new route up El Capitan.
We didn't so much create the route as discover it. It was there, it was embedded in the rock.
Along the way, they honored an earlier adventure.
They didn't have a name for it. They were calling it the southwest face of El Cap. Well, that's a stupid name. So we call that the Salothe Wall.
It's great not because it's hard, but because it has so many wonderful qualities that you want to find on a big wall. Good bivouac spots, for one thing. Different types of climbing, excellent rock, different types of problems that require figuring out a not straightforward, but an elegant kind of roundabout route that makes the most of the rock. And it's beautifully situated on the side of El Capitan.
Standing in the meadow, the El Cap meadow, looking up at El Capitan, it's a frightening thing. And for a climber, it is so frightening that we have to go up. And the view down at the meadow from up high on El Capitan is a lot less frightening than the view from the meadow looking up.
At a time when astronauts first viewed Earth from outer space, the granite astronauts of Yosemite continue to explore new routes on its vertical frontier.
Hope you're ready to give it your all, PF.
In 1965, Yvon Chouinard and T.M. Herbert became the first two-man team to climb El Capitan when they made the first ascent of the Muir Wall. Herbert's version is questionable.
I was very strong and giant of a man, and so Yvon, being 5'4", I had to put him in the pack and carry him, and so it was pretty much me, and he just went along for the ride.
T.M. Herbert got to be proud of his precedent-setting two-man climb for a whole year, until he learned that Royal Robbins was at the summit, having done the same route, alone. It was the first solo climb of El Capitan. Almost all Yosemite climbs that had been done and were yet to be done had one thing in common, besides guts and grit and granite. They began in a scraggly, often uncomfortable, boulder-strewn campground called Camp 4. The campground itself became part of the legend of Yosemite.
Not all of it was like the ideal, pristine camping experience. It was a more crowded campground. So like there'd be, maybe like a dozen people in the site next to you and a dozen on the other side, and Germans singing German songs late into the night. There's the bears breaking into your stuff at night. There's rangers hassling you for wanting to, sleep under the eaves of the bathroom when it's pouring rain. Or just a real intense camping experience, not a wilderness one. It had like a real strong Yosemite feel that no other place I've been to has.
In the early 60s, the rangers were okay about us staying there for a long period. They didn't bother us. The limit was always 14 days, I believe, but nobody cared. In the mid-60s, the rangers started enforcing this, and we'd have to do tricks. Leave for 2 or 3 days, come back, a little different shape, different car or something.
Camp 4 could get really ugly when it rained, and that would bring out the devil in everybody. I mean, it was muddy, and there's bad fights and pettiness and thievery, and yeah, I mean it's the same kind of stuff you'd see around any kind of boom town or frontier place you're going to see there, and spades.
It was the most free existence you can imagine. It didn't cost anything to stay there, and we would live on just oatmeal, maybe 50 cents a day. You could live there and climb and be part of this whole revolution in climbing.
More and more people began to stay there longer and longer, and then people took climbing more and more serious, and jobs and your education were backseat to the serious climbers of that era.
The great thing about Camp 4, which still exists today, is that there's a community of climbers, international community, and it was always so exciting to think about being around the camp and running into this person or that person.
I remember when they closed Camp 4 for renovation. We had to camp in another camp area, and it was interesting, that there wasn't the community, there wasn't the energy. It was sort of more diffused. That can give you an idea of the impact that a place like Camp 4 would have on climbing.
The Curry Company, which ran the commercial part of Yosemite, considered Camp 4 and its camping climbers so wild, the site was made off-limits to employees. That, of course, made it even more interesting to the female employees. One was a hostess and dining room manager at Yosemite's Awane Hotel.
Just aware there were people out there, in the bushes and sleeping under the rocks and living in Camp 4 that were doing this thing called climbing. The climbers were a kind of scruffy lot, and they didn't fit into what it was that the Curry Company was encouraging in terms of their tourists. And they also didn't care much about the values of the Curry Company, and they just were there to climb. So they would camp out and come into the Curry Company often to the village cafeteria to eat, looking not very good at all, sometimes eating things that were left on the plates by the tourists, and making themselves basically pretty unpopular.
We look back and think of it as a very wretched existence, but actually we're at that stage of life where all young boys are wretched, That's just the way it is. But to be able to grow up there was a phenomenal experience, absolutely phenomenal.
Well, we were climbers, but we were also lost souls. We didn't know what our future would be. I guess we kind of thought we'd climb forever.
We would come to Yosemite and sometimes spend months there and doing what we please. Camp out, live frugally, climb what we wanted, and relax in the meadows, walk about the valley. For practical purposes, we owned it, and it was like we owned it, and if you own land like that, you're a king.
Herb, my friend there, was a climber. So we went out to Camp 4. While we were sitting at the campfire, I just became aware that somebody was really staring at me in a way that made me very uncomfortable.
I invited her to go climbing. She accepted.
The romance went beyond a vertical first date. In 1967, Royal helped Liz make mountaineering history.
I guess the best thing we've done together was the Face a Half Dome. Climbed it 10 years after I made the first ascent, and she became the first woman to climb it.
It took a lot from me, first of all, to just even approach the idea of doing something as big as that. You don't quite realize when you do a lot of climbing, even very steep climbing, what vertical means. And that wall is vertical. And when you're on a vertical wall, it doesn't feel like it's vertical. It feels like it's overhanging. It feels like it's pushing out.
Liz Robbins knew that she was forging a route not only for herself.
The kind of climbing we were doing in Yosemite was still relatively new. It was an unusual girl or woman who ended up there on her own just because she wanted to climb.
It wasn't something women did then. That's not just, I'm not implying that they couldn't do it, because obviously they did do it, but it just wasn't part of the ethos or mentality at that time to get involved in something like that. So it was really just a boys' club.
People ask me so often, well, why didn't more women climb back then? And I think a large factor was not just the climbing, but it was the lifestyle here. Women just didn't go off by themselves to go live in a tent in the woods and not have a job and be a total bum yet.
Largely, they never thought of women climbing, and so they never even were invited for a long time.
Kidding? It was welcomed. Sort of got a little bit boring up there sometimes when it was just us fellas kicking around Camp 4.
They didn't want to climb with the women because they didn't think we'd be good enough.
Sibylla Hechtel was anxious to prove them wrong. So was her energetic climbing partner, Bev Johnson. In 1973, 5 years before Johnson became the first woman to climb El Capitan solo, she decided the time had come for a team of women to climb it.
She was determined. She was going to do El Cap. She was going to do an all-women's ascent. We felt a lot of pressure when we went up on that climb because so many people said, oh, you guys will never get up. The success rate was always, around 50%. I mean, people would go up, then they'd run out of water, run out of food, discover how hard it really was, and retreat. And so we took extras of everything. It turned out we had just about the right amount.
Ed Carter of the American Alpine Journal invited Sibylla to write about the trip, the first all-female ascent of El Capitan.
I wanted other women to know that 2 women had done this and that women were climbing, and I entitled it Walls Without Balls. I got a letter back from Carter saying, well, he says, I'm sorry. He says, I love your title. I think it's a great title, but the board of directors won't let me use it. He said, how about keeping a breast on El Cap? I was furious. I wrote them this really nasty letter. I said, what's the matter? I mean, how come you want to use female body parts in a climbing article and we can't use male body parts? This is totally unacceptable.
The article ran with no title at all. The phenomenon of women climbers, successful record-breaking women climbers, was only one of several revolutions on the stone faces of Yosemite. The climbs and the climbers themselves were changing.
Each climb you did, you'd come back with a greater sense of confidence. And we were really pushing the standards, making huge advancements. And that's the most exciting time of any sport.
Yvonne Chenard and Tom Frost were leading another revolution in the valley, one centered on equipment.
Tom Frost and I tried to climb Cat Pinnacle, and we got up there and we tried pounding in pitons and cracks, and they wouldn't go in. It was real tiny little hairline cracks, very incipient, and all the pitons that we had were way too thick.
We worked on what Yvonne called the realized ultimate reality piton, the RERP. This RERP would force its way into a seam. With these various tools, we were able to climb the walls without the use of many bolts at all.
They made the RERPs out of an extra hard type of metal called chromoly steel and headed back up Cat Pinnacle.
I was pretty spooked out using this tiny little thing that was only in, 1/8 of an inch, but it held my weight, and we did the first ascent of this climb.
Pitons, no matter how little, are regarded as active protection because they are hammered into the rock. Passive protection doesn't mar the rock at all. The most primitive kind of passive protection was a pebble. Early mountaineers would tie a rope around a pebble, place the pebble in one crack after another, and pull themselves up a mountain. Pebbles evolved into manufactured chalk stones, chalks for short. In 1967, Royal and Liz Robbins used an updated version of the chalk stone called a nut, adapted from machine nuts to climb Yosemite's Nutcracker route. It was the first U.S. climb done entirely with the nuts, or portable chalk stones, instead of pitons.
By that time, we really were becoming aware of the fact that cracks were being destroyed by pitons, and that it was something that was going to get a lot worse, and classic, wonderful routes were going to change in nature so that they really wouldn't be the same at all.
We decided to change our whole company over and go to making these chalks, these little aluminum blocks that you can put in with your finger in the crack. Just set them in there and they're just as strong as pitons. But you know, not very many climbers agreed with us, because you're telling someone who has a whole history of taking a piton and pounding it in with a 20-ounce hammer up to the hilt, and that can hold, 10,000 pounds, and you tell them, look, you can do the same thing with this little chalk, and you just put it in like this with your fingers. They're not going to believe you.
To make them believe, Chenard went up the nose of El Capitan again. He did use pitons that were already in place, but just put in chalks the rest of the way. Climber Ray Jardine, who was also a NASA engineer, found another way to protect the rock and the climbers. His revolutionary design was a spring-loaded camming device known as a friend that could be placed in a crack with one hand. While some climbers adopted the philosophy of less is more, less equipment, less damage to the rock, Warren Harding was not among them. In 1970, he and another climber, Dean Caldwell, fought their way up an untried route of El Capitan, the Dawn Wall. They ran into storms, ran low on food. About the 20th day into the climb, still some 500 feet from the summit, about all they had left was determination.
We noticed there's an awful lot of activity, aerial activity, expensive helicopters flying by. I wonder what all that is. And about this time we hear this yelling from down below, and it was T.M. Herbert. Well, what are you doing here, T.M.? Come to rescue you. What? Well, we got screaming back down, no, we're not going to be rescued.
And the Park Service offered to rescue him from the storm, and he refused. And it hit all the newspapers of the United States. And George Hartzog, the director of the National Park Service, he phoned me from Washington because he knew of my climbing ability. And he says, Dick, is that justified to refuse the rescue, or is he just showing off for the newspapers? I said, no. I said, it's just part of the human desire to do something that's never been done before, like the North Pole and the South Pole. I said, if you start in the Park Service to prohibit that kind of climbing, then you're going to interfere with one of the great values of American ingenuity.
On day 27, they reached the summit.
I led this last little pitch. Get up, and my God, I am absolutely flabbergasted when I see all these people with their cameras pointing at us. It really did become a circus of sorts.
Harding and Caldwell received more than national media attention when they summited. Some climbers thought their use of more than 300 bolts was excessive.
We thought, gee, if everybody starts coming, you're going to have 100 routes in El Capitan with 1,000 bolts each. What's the point? It lowers the quality of climbing. And so we wanted to make a statement that we disagreed with that. And so we decided to climb Warren's route and take all of the bolts out. So we started up there with that goal. And we took out about, I don't know, somewhere between 25 and 50 bolts. I can't remember now. And about that time, we started realizing, hey, the quality of this route where he didn't bolt is really high. This is the best climbing Warren has ever done. It was everything we could do to go where he had gone, where he just used pitons, you know. So again, to raise our level of respect and admiration. And I started feeling, this doesn't feel right. We're going to look really stupid to start out like this, removing the bolts and then stop. It's going to look really stupid to do it either way. So it was a no-win situation, but I decided what felt right was to stop and go ahead and climb it and leave it at that.
The quest to find and climb ever more challenging routes pointed to a greater dilemma. What's a competitive climber to do that is new?
And the real big obvious lines on the giant walls were done. So people were starting to do these contrived routes.
The routes were harder, but they lacked that distinction of being the first line up, a real face.
I think when I started climbing, there was 2 routes on El Capitan. The nose of El Capitan, the Salate Wall. So I had a good historical position. I got to see both the beginning and what we'll call the next stage after the Golden Age. We moved into the Platinum Age.
Platinum Age or not, the defining word was stone. The arrival at Camp 4 in 1974 of the Stone Masters. They were young climbers who set out to demolish the old standards of climbing and to triumph over the old rating systems. A 5'10", for example, was very difficult. John Long was a Stone Master.
The thing that distinguished, that's a stretch to use that word, but distinguished the Stone Masters is 1, you had to climb Valhalla, which is 5'11", one of the hardest routes in the country. 2, you had to be a young, arrogant punk. And 3, you had to have a capacity to smoke enormous amounts, prodigious amounts of really, really bad marijuana. And we all had those talents, and so that was sort of the glue that held the whole thing together.
The free-spirited times were reflected in the names of the new routes such as Mescalito, Tangerine Trip, Electric Ladyland.
Bridwell, who was the high llama of the whole scene, he was just enough older than us that he seemed to know everything. So he was very influential. His philosophy really was always just do the hardest thing in the best style and do as many of those kind of things as you possibly can.
In 1975, Bridwell suggested to 2 of his Stonemaster protégés, Long and Billy Westbay, that the 3 of them together climb the nose of El Capitan in a single day. He chose the longest day of the year, which fortuitously coincided with free lighting, a full moon. It would illuminate their 4 a.m. start. Despite the advantages of time and light, Long found the very idea of the quest daunting.
El Capitan Day, that started off as like a pipe dream in the early 70s. Wow, think about climbing El Capitan Day, and it was always thought to be ridiculous, impossible. A lot of it had to do with the gear. The gear was just so crude compared to what we had nowadays. We got together, Bridwell, Billy Westbay, and myself, that had 3 different sort of talents, and it just blended real well, and we had a really good game plan. We were all really in pretty good shape, and waited for a long day, and we just did it. One of the things that makes El Cap and climbing Yosemite such a great thing, and that is the medium itself is so much more spectacular than any other sport. So you can have a $1 zillion price or purse and 50 million seeing the US Open or the Olympics or whatever, but it's still people beating a little ball over a net on a piece of cement, okay? When you're doing something historic on something like that is, we're not getting paid to do this, but boy, nobody in any sport, no Super Bowl, no World Series, can even remotely touch this. Yeah, that's why it's the king of the sports,
Jim Bridwell put up the most difficult rock climbing routes anywhere in the world during the 70s. These were fearsome routes. Talk about fear. Climbers feared some of the routes that Bridwell put up. There were sections, pitches, that were reputed to be, if you fall, you die.
I copy. Talk to you when I get in place. Okay.
The routes up Yosemite were all fearsome to varying degrees, and with good reason. Between 1960 and 1990, 55 climbers lost their lives trying to master the uncaring walls. In 1970, the Park Service began a program to rescue climbers as well as lost and injured tourists. Yosemite Search and Rescue, better known as YOSAR, consisted of 20 climbers who were on call to help at any time. Part of their pay was free campsites in Camp 4. YOSAR developed many innovative rescue techniques that were adopted worldwide, but could not prevent all the climbing deaths in the valley. There are about 2 a year now. The climbs have continued. Danger always will be part of the challenge. While climbers rely on better equipment to help them reach ever more demanding heights, they also look for something almost as important: better shoes. In the 1800s, climbers used moccasins dipped in sticky tree sap. In the 1930s, they found that cheap Japanese shoes worked well.
The soles were only 1/8 of an inch thick, and you could just wrap your toes around every bit of rock and stick them in the cracks, and they're very flexible.
Up until the middle 1960s, the climbers wore whatever type of shoe they could get a hold of. That could be a hiking boot, a work boot, a tennis shoe. It wasn't until the middle 1960s that the climbers really had a good climbing shoe, and that was the EB climbing shoe.
In the early 1980s, a Spanish shoe manufacturer came up with goma cocida, in English, cooked rubber. The manufacturer asked a confident young climber named John Backer to try out a pair.
The rubber was like not just a little bit better, it was like 25% better than anything I ever tried. First shipment came in, I think it was like 264 pair to the mountain shop. There was a line of, I don't know how many people, 100, 150 people outside the mountain shop at 9 a.m. when they opened, and they sold all 264 pair in about an hour.
The Spanish soles of cooked rubber soon were engaged in another ongoing revolution: free climbing. In free climbing, pitons and ropes are used only for protection, not for help getting up the vast vertical sweeps.
That was the more athletic sort of expression of climbing, as opposed to just standing in slings and constructing, or sort of, a carpenter's job moving up a cliff.
Free climbing is the natural evolution of climbing. The whole idea was to adapt ourselves to the rock using the natural features and not rely on the gear so much.
Todd Skinner and climbing partner Paul Piana put up the first free ascent of the South A Wall 27 years after Royal Robbins, Tom Frost, and Chuck Pratt first climbed it.
I think that the magic in free climbing is when you get right to the edge of what you're capable of doing. Now, what that means is that your power is being tested, your mind is being tested, your ability to solve problems under terrible time pressure is being tested, and right at that moment where you might or might not make it, I think is where all of the payback comes from ever leaving the ground.
The audacious success of Americans free climbing the vast walls of Yosemite brought a new batch of admirers to the valley.
Then you had Europeans coming to Yosemite to see what we had. What you guys got over here that making you guys be able to do all these climbs that nobody else in the world is doing at this time.
Rock climbing, what had been an obsession for a few people in the 1930s, was becoming an international obsession.
What we were learning on big walls is now being applied, all over the world, on giant walls in the Karakoram and Baffin Island and places like that.
While some climbers took the expertise they learned in Yosemite to the mountains of the world, other climbers found unexpected challenges right at home in Camp 4. Camp 4 offers spectacular bouldering, the sport of climbing impossible-looking boulders. For months in 1978, two of the best climbers in the country, John Backer and Ron Kauk, attempted to climb Midnight Lightning, the seemingly unclimbable route up Columbia Boulder set in the middle of Camp 4.
The fact that it's overhanging like that is a little unique for this area, because generally the rock granite, that we climb is vertical and with cracks in it and all that, and anything overhanging is usually so smooth you can't hang on to it. But this particular boulder is really unique for its sculptured holds.
And we started working on it, and pretty soon me and Kauk were getting up to the last moves all the time. Kauk, he was getting ready for another try. We'd rest about 5 minutes between attempts. And he got up there, got to the move, and he's just like barely doing it. All of a sudden he just popped over the move and grabbed this hold, and he did it. And our mouths just dropped.
Back on the walls of Yosemite, the move was away from the team approach. Climbers were trying hard routes, free solo, without any protection at all.
Two types of soloing. One, you solo big walls, and then in effect you're doing close to 3 times as much work as you are when you're climbing with someone, because you have to climb the pitch, then you have to come back down the pitch, which means you go over it twice, then you have to go back up the pitch climbing the rope you left to take out all your gear. So you're going over the same rock 3 times. The other type of soloing is when you solo without a rope, and the main difference there is the potential danger is greater, because if you fall, you're dead.
John Backer took free soloing to new heights.
I soloed a climb called New Dimensions in Yosemite. That was the first 511 in Yosemite. Me and Kauk were down there. I go, hey Kauk, I'm gonna do this thing. And he's like, I'll watch. And I soloed it, and people didn't accept it as art. People kind of looked at you like you're a lunatic. But deep inside, I was kind of smiling because it wasn't that big a thing, really.
Dean Potter's blend of free soloing and ropeless aid soloing set new levels of possibility on the walls of Yosemite.
During a big solo climb like the nose, I'm so in the moment I almost don't feel anything but what I'm doing. It's such an extreme thing. The exposure would be overwhelming if you let it come in to your focus. One thing is the point of commitment when you leave the ground, and then the point of commitment when there's no turning back, where you have to go up because going down isn't an option.
One misconception, of course, that the tourist in the valley floor has is that everybody that leaves the ground has a death wish. Well, climbers respect height more than about anybody else, and the free soloists in particular, they're not wanting to die naturally. There is a strange reward in risking dying. That is a very odd, almost has a drug value to it that is sort of addictive.
The big thing was to do something, anything, that no one else had done. Charting and climbing your own route, free climbing an old route, free soloing a route, climbing routes faster, or climbing 2 or more routes in a day. The term is enchainment. In 1986, Peter Croft decided to enchain in a single day 2 of the most famous rock climbs in the world, the nose of El Capitan and the northwest face of Half Dome, more than a vertical mile in all.
I'd been thinking about it for years. It was such an obvious thing for a non-climber to go into Yosemite Valley and just go, well, which are the 2 cliffs that strike you the hardest?
He was looking for a partner to do it, and I said, I'll do it. We could do that, no problem.
We started at midnight. We didn't really go that fast on El Cap. We topped out around 10 in the morning, which, by today's standards isn't like that fast. And then we were pretty leisurely about the whole thing. We had some lunch over at the stables and then just started hiking up.
Took us 4 hours and 3 minutes on Half Dome. We came down, it's still light. We were gonna go do some more climbs, but we decided just to go to the bar and have some beers instead, and that was it.
That and similar feats inspired a former All-America pole vaulter.
For the last 50 years, every single standard was met and pushed and beaten in Yosemite. Free climbing standards, aid standards, length of time on a long wall route, everything. And I think it's due to the fact that it's acceptable to, one-up the people next to you, camping next to you, or, as I say, be motivated off their accomplishments to go do something better.
Hans Florine calls himself very competitive. In 1993, in one day, he and partner Steve Schneider enchained 3 routes on El Capitan, including the nose. It took them 23 hours. That same year, he and Peter Croft accomplished a speed ascent of El Capitan's now well-traveled nose.
We kind of casually got up and started, I think, at like 6:30 or something, and he had a t-shirt and shorts on, and after the first pitch, he threw his t-shirt off, and all he had was a little bottle of water. It wasn't even a liter, and I'm just like, wow, I guess we're kind of going for it here.
4 hours and 22 minutes later, they topped out. Enter Lynn Hill with her own plan for the nose. After succeeding on the first free ascent of the nose in 1993, she decided to become the first person, male or female, to free climb it in a day.
One of the reasons why it was even more attractive to me, because I knew a lot of guys had tried it, and they all said, oh, it's too thin under the great roof, never be able to do it. The very last pitch on El Cap is overhanging. It's a pretty impressive place to be, and you look down and you just know that you don't want to be making any mistakes.
On her first attempt, Hill had to give up. She ran out of something nearly as vital as water, the chalk dust climbers put on their hands to help grip the rock.
No chalk and being tired in the middle of the sun, I just couldn't do it. So better planning the next time. On the day that I actually did it, I had an exciting moment on the pitch that I had to do it in the sunlight because my protection fell out, and I looked down and it looked like I could fall onto a ledge. And I thought, well, should I renounce the effort? No, I want to do it in perfect style, okay. And I had a couple pieces of protection that I planned to put up higher, and one of them actually fit where I needed it, so I put it in and kept going. And then on the Camp 6 pitch, I had a lot of trouble, as it turned out, after 18 hours of climbing, and I started falling once, twice, 3 times, and I thought, oh no, how could I not be able to do it here? So I just summoned everything I could, because I thought, this is just too important. I thought about all the people that, I knew when I was younger in Camp 4, all the climbing heroes and people that inspired me, the guy that taught me to climb, and I thought, all these people are with me now, and they all want me to do it, so I'm gonna do it. And I did.
The attraction of a 1989 climb was less the route than the climbers. Mike Corbett is known as Mr. El Cap for having climbed it more than 50 times. Mark Wellman's a climber who is also a paraplegic. He had never climbed El Cap.
We kind of took the approach that the astronauts did. I mean, these people were doing something that had never been done before, going to the moon. And for us, no paraplegic had ever climbed El Capitan. And, we had to be real serious about it. The night before blast-off, I was really nervous. And as soon as we got up to the base, and it was difficult getting to the base, but once we got to the base and I touched the rock, all of a sudden, everything kind of fell into place. For me, it was doing the equivalent of 7,000 pull-ups in 7 days. For Corbett, it was doing the work of someone soloing it. So it was a big endeavor for both of us. Very last pitch was really super low angle, and I was crawling, and Mike said, just jump on my back. Adventure sports for people in wheelchairs, really an untouched sports, and what Corbett and I did was real groundbreaking and show the possibilities that were out there.
While one challenge after another got dreamed up, an unexpected obstacle threatened the challengers' dreaming ground, Camp 4 itself. In 1997, the so-called flood of the century caused by El Nino made Yosemite's Merced River overflow and inundated much of Yosemite Valley. The floodwaters washed out low-lying campgrounds and housing for Yosemite employees and visitors. Camp 4 was on higher ground, and so it was spared for a while. Then, the National Park Service came up with a plan. Rebuild the employee and guest housing on the higher ground of Camp 4. That could have been the end of Camp 4.
Being in Yosemite in Camp 4 for several months and feeling the place and seeing where the buildings were going to be and being aware of the magnitude of the construction, I became disheartened. This is really a bad thing. The National Park Service ship has gotten off course. It's so far off course that it's in a different ocean. And together, we need to get it back where it belongs.
I got a phone call from my law office one day, and he said, my name's Tom Frost. Do you know who I am? And I said, of course I know who you are. Anybody who's ever climbed knows who Tom Frost is. And he asked me whether I'd heard about the development at Camp 4. And I said, yeah. He said, well, I want you to represent me and stop it. It's not hard to pull together the dream team if you know Tom Frost. So I just asked Tom to call a guy named Royal Robbins. And Royal Robbins basically just said, if Tom cares, I care. Then Tom called Yvonne Chenard, and Yvonne just said, if Tom Frost is in, I'm in. It just went from there. Everyone woke up that actually something might be able to be done here.
Tom was here in the Golden Age, and he saw how important the Camp 4 was for the entire history of Yosemite climbing. And he kind of taught us all that and made us realize that what was here wasn't just a campground, that it was really the birthplace of climbing.
In the spring of 1998, in San Francisco, climbers and National Park Service officials held a meeting. They had never been allies.
The relationship between the National Park Service and the climbing community is a very antagonistic relationship. I think the National Park Service here at Yosemite always viewed them as a different, maybe class of citizen that was coming to the park, using it in very different ways than the traditional park visitor, and maybe a little bit more of a free spirit.
It's a relationship that's filled with tension. Stereotypes get bred and people just live with stereotypes on both sides. On the other hand, the Park Service relies heavily on the climbing community, particularly at Camp 4, for helping out with search and rescues for the average visitor, the 8-year-old child that's lost.
And there's lots of built-up feeling that the Park Service is ruining the parks and that we are the pure environmentalists and that they are the bureaucrats. And it's very easy to skip from that to enjoying hating them. And Tom Frost said no way. He would never allow us to indulge in that.
Tom Frost also said at that meeting, we're here because we care about something very deeply that we believe you should care about as well. And this is never going to be about being angry at each other.
Despite forced civility, neither side would budge. Besides asking Dick Duane to be the lead attorney in the case, Frost asked the American Alpine Club to join the climbers if a lawsuit needed to be filed.
We'd never taken legal action against the Park Service. This was kind of a shocking idea.
Shocking, but true. They joined the lawsuit to protect Camp 4. Then the climbers took a bolder step in this latest Yosemite adventure. They started the process of having their beloved, scruffy, boulder-strewn campground placed on the National Register of Historic Places. The response overwhelmed everyone.
The French, the Austrians, the Japanese, the South Americans were all emailing us or writing us saying they're with us.
The world came together and said, there are 3 important places in the world in the history of climbing. They are the base camp at Mount Everest, the base camp at Chamonix, and Camp 4. Suddenly, the whole evolution of my thought about what Camp 4 was just took a huge growth or flip-flop or whatever one would call it to recognize that, in fact, we had something at least of national significance and maybe of international significance right there in Yosemite Valley. This broadened my view of what history can be, made me think about how these walls relate to the whole stretch of American history and this little camp down there. And what kind of people make history is not necessarily the Thomas Jeffersons or the General Grants of the world. It might just be kids that are coming out here and are passionate about expanding themselves in a place like Yosemite.
So the Park Service agreed. Camp 4 should be saved. And it was deemed eligible to be placed on the National Register of Historic Places. Not guaranteed a place, just eligible. The good news was good enough for a celebration and a grand reunion. In September 1999, climbers representing 70 years of climbing met in Yosemite.
Feeling of spirituality about a place is not a single thing. It's when you have multiple memories and history, and it all comes together into something so that when you look at it, it always resonates in your mind. That's there for me in Yosemite and Camp 4 more than any place in the world.
Most of us were just climbers, and I don't know, maybe we haven't used our brains as much as we could have, but at least we found the best place in the world to climb our brains out. So, see you with that. Thanks.
And it's like Yvonne said, you know, the super alpinists would come out of Yosemite. What we didn't understand is for that to be fulfilled, the whole world has to come to Camp 4 first. It's been a great being a part of it.
The legacy of Camp 4 looks safe. So does the legacy of Yosemite as a spectacular and beautiful place to test oneself. Although older climbers, the pioneers, have the glory of many first ascents, that is not stopping younger climbers from pushing the limits and inventing their own challenges. Yosemite can absorb them all, their bodies and their spirit.